Hello again. Today's video is going to be all about writing a narrative story. So this is the final narrative video in our lessons. So by this point, you should know that a narrative is a story that you tell about maybe an experience you had. It could be an experience that you had that you kind of make some tweaks to. It could be an experience that you've never had and a story that you completely make up. But a narrative is a fiction story or a story that you write based on real events that we would still consider fiction. So by this point, you should also know that there are some elements of a narrative, and I have those here on the screen for us. So the elements of a narrative are listed here. Theme, which is the lesson or message that the author wants you to take away after you've read the story. So be thinking about, like, what lesson do I want my reader to learn from my story? Setting. The setting is the place or the time period in which the event occurs. So where is this going to happen? Is it happening in history? Is it happening in present day? Is it happening outside? Is it happening in a house? Where is your event taking place? Characters, that's pretty cut and dried, right? Characters are just who's going to be in my story. Point of view, that's the point of view that you'll tell your story in. So it's very important that when you write your story that you maintain the same point of view the whole time. So if you start with first person and you're using words like I, me, my, we, us, you're going to stick to that tense, right? And then if you're going to write in second person, you stay in that tense. And if you're going to write in third person, you stay in that tense. So if you need to, you can Google point of view, and that will give you some information about what is included in each point of view for second and third person. So you need to choose a point of view and stay in that point of view the entire time. And then authors always use techniques, right, when they write. And in narratives, a really big technique that they use is dialogue. So I'm just going to add that here. Dialogue is when characters talk in a story. And so typically when we see dialogue, we see quotation marks around the characters speaking, and then it will be followed with like he exclaimed or she said or he replied. So we want to have some dialogue or some other authors' techniques like descriptive language in our story, in our narrative. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're following a plot. So you've been learning about plot in English and language arts since you were in second grade. And plot is just that kind of curve that we follow. And if we go down here, we have an exposition, which is just like our introduction. We introduce the characters, the setting, build the background information. Then we have our rising action, where some events happen that kind of lead up to this big climax where there's a turning point in the story and something eventful happens that really makes us continue wanting to read, right? And that's called our climax. And then we have our falling action, where we kind of are leading, the events that are happening are kind of leading us into our resolution. So that's what plot is, just a real quick overview. So we want to make sure when we write our narrative that we have these narrative elements included in our narrative. If you need information as you begin writing, because you're going to write a narrative today, that's the outcome. If you need some information about what each of these elements is, you can visit this link right here. Okay. This is a great little resource. This teacher has put together a PowerPoint, and thankfully it's in PDF format. And basically, he or she has described the elements of a narrative text, and then he or she has also given us a really great description of what each of those are. So if you forget, you can access this link for those, okay? So here's what you're going to do today. You are going to create a narrative story based on an experience that you've had. If you're like, whoa, I've had lots of experiences, I just don't know what to write about, I have a really nifty list down here. Potential narrative topics. Your first day of school, the most exciting day of school, something embarrassing that happened to you, a time when you went to an amusement park. So you can read through some of these potential topics here And if you're struggling to come up with some kind of storyline or what to write about, this is a really great spot to get some narrative topics on this doc here. So another topic that you could write about that just happened was quarantine. That's huge, right? That's a really big event in your life. So maybe you'd like to write your story about your experience since you've been out of school. That would be a really great narrative topic too. So really quick, I'm just going to kind of walk you through this organizer so that you can see what I'm expecting from you when you write a narrative, and all of the parts that you would need to put together a really strong narrative. And then once you've worked through the organizer, you can actually convert the organizer to writing, and then you can plug it into Grammarly and do your spell check, and you have a nice narrative written. So the first thing you're going to do is kind of identify what is the problem, situation, or observation I'm going to make in order to hook my reader at the very beginning. Because we really want to hook our reader at the beginning of a story. I've had kids tell me before, well, Mr. Love, I start reading a book and I don't know, it's just boring. And I always tell kids, you have to give it at least 1/3 of the book. So, if it's a 120-page book, 120 divided by 3, 1/3 would be 40 pages. So we'd have to give that book at least 40 pages before we abandoned it and said, it's just not for me. So you want to really hook your reader at the beginning so that he or she wants to keep reading. Then we're going to introduce our characters. Who are my characters going to be? And how am I going to introduce them? What point of view am I going to write in? Is the narrator going to be the person telling the story? That's first person. Is the reader going to be the character in the story, a second person? Or is the narrator just going to be telling the story of the characters, which would be third person? So you decide which one of those points of view you'd like to tell your story in, and then stick to that. And then, which techniques do you want to use as an author? Do you want to use descriptive language, dialogue? There's lots of techniques that you can use. So just kind of think about what you might want to use as an author. Then, what do you want your theme to be? What message or lesson do you want your reader to take away from reading your story? Okay. Then think about your setting. How are you going to set up your story? Where is it going to be? What are some places that it might occur? You can skip how will I hook the reader in the beginning of the story because we kind of talked about that up here. So actually, I'll just go ahead and erase that. We'll just forget about that one. And then characters in the story. There's a spot for 4 characters, but you can add more or you could have fewer. Maybe there's only going to be 2 characters in your story. Maybe you're going to have 6 or 7 or 8 characters in your story. That's fine. Just add or remove as necessary. So we're going to think about what the character's name might be. We'll list that here. What are some traits that the character might have? So remember, traits are what someone is like. So smart, funny, maybe they're arrogant. Okay. So what are the traits of the character? And then what are some of the main things that you want this character to do in the story? Then we get to the main problem, the conflict. That's a big part, right? What's the conflict in the story? So we'll put here conflict because that's a big part of a narrative. What's our big problem? And then we get to that plot, which we talked about earlier, and you'll just kind of list what's going to happen in each part of the plot. Okay. You can open your own Google document. Obviously, this will not have to be turned in, but you can open your own Google document and you can just start writing your story on your Google document as you're kind of filling out this organizer or once you have the organizer filled out. Everyone's brain works differently. As a writer, I might only put like just a couple of notes on each of these and then I'm ready to write. Other people might need a little bit more time with the organizer and they might really spend a good amount of time working on the organizer. So that way, when they're prepared to write, they can just take their organizer here and convert it over to writing. So again, potential topics here. Objective today is to write a narrative. This is your final narrative lesson of the unit. So you should be prepared to write one independently. You've had lots of practice as long as you've watched the previous videos. So if you'd like to share it with me, that would be awesome. I'd love to read narratives that you write. That would be so awesome, actually. So I will list my email up here. If you would like to share with me once you have written your narrative, I would love to read it. So here's my email address. Okay, and you are welcome to share it with me. Also, the Right Touch next year, it's a publication that we have district-wide. And it's really neat. It's a little magazine if you've never seen it, and it's produced, and the students that are published in it are strictly students from Council Bluffs. So Lewis Central Schools, St. Albert Schools, Council Bluffs Community School District, Heartland Christian. And it's an awesome opportunity for you to get recognized if you love to write and if you're good at what you do. So if you're interested, I'd be more than happy to submit a narrative that you write next year, or an excerpt, a part of your narrative, to the Right Touch for you. So anyway, I hope that you have a great time writing this narrative. It's really fun and just a creative activity for you. Have a wonderful day.